Democratic Studies at the Endowment for Democracy. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to a discussion entitled Saudi Arabia, Opposing Democracy at Home and Abroad. Since the onset of the Arab Spring, the authorities in Saudi Arabia have pursued an increasingly repressive course, seeking to maintain the status quo in an environment where expectations are markedly changing. In this context, Saudi Arabia faces a series of daunting challenges, including high youth unemployment, an education system ill-suited to meet the needs of a modern economy, the ability to diversify from a hydrocarbon-reliant economy, and the growth of political extremism. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia is devoting considerable resources and taking a more active role in the Middle East in an effort to suppress nascent reform movements in response to challenges from Iran, its principal rival in the region. And in the most recent period, the Middle East is faced with the emergence of the so-called Islamic State, which is wreaking violent mayhem across the region and creating a new set of serious challenges there. Given these developments and the stakes involved, we're really very pleased to have three leading experts with us today who will discuss key issues relating to Saudi Arabia's domestic challenges and its influence on democratic development beyond its borders. And I'll say just a few words about our speakers. We'll start with Bernard Haykel, who is Professor of Near Eastern Studies and the Director of the Trans-Regional Institute for the Study of the Middle East and North Africa at Princeton University. He was formerly Professor of Islamic and Middle Eastern History at New York University. His primary research interests center on Islamic political movements and legal thought. At present, he studies the history and politics of the Arabian Peninsula and Islamism. He's published extensively on the Salafi movement, pre-modern and modern manifestations. Professor is currently editing a volume with Thomas Heghammer and Stéphane Lacroix entitled Saudi Arabia in Transition, Insights on Social, Political, Economic, and Religious Change, which will be published by Cambridge University Press in November 2014. He's also the author of Revival and Reform in Islam, The Legacy of Muhammad al-Shawkani, which was published by the Cambridge University Press. Karen Elliott-House, retired in 2006 as publisher of the Wall Street Journal, Senior Vice President of Dow Jones & Company, and a member of the company's executive committee. She's a broadly experienced business executive with particular expertise and experience in international, stemming from a distinguished 32-year career as a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and editor. Her most recent book is On Saudi Arabia, Its People, Past, Religion, Fault Lines, and Future, which was published by Random House in 2013. And Francois Seznec is an adjunct professor at the School of Business at Georgetown University and at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He teaches classes on finance, energy, and politics in the Persian Gulf. He's published and lectured extensively on chemical and energy-based industries in the Gulf and their importance in world trade. He's interviewed regularly on national and international media. He has 25 years of experience in international banking and finance, of which 10 years were spent in the Middle East. He's managing partner of the Lafayette Group, a US-based consulting and investment. His research centers on the influence of the Arab-Persian Gulf political and social variables on the financial and oil markets in the region. So we'll have remarks from each of the speakers for about 10 minutes or so. I may ask a question or two after they're done. We'll have plenty of time for discussion with the audience here. I suspect there'll be a good deal of interest. We'll start with Jean-Francois Seznec, and we'll make our way across the table to Bernard Haykel. Just mention before we get started that for those of you who are following on Twitter, you can follow the International Forum for Democratic Studies at Think Democracy and the National Endowment for Democracy at Ned Democracy. I'd kindly ask those of you who haven't yet to silence yourself. And with that, I'm very pleased to hand things over to Jean-Francois Seznec.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you. It's quite an honor to be here, and it's very humbling to be in the presence of so many people who know so many things, which makes me feel like I know nothing. But the more I study this for the past 40 years, the more I discovered that I really know nothing. So maybe that's a good sign. In any event, what I would like to discuss today is perhaps the more internal aspect of things in Saudi Arabia. Of course, everything changes every minute of the day in the region right now, and Bernard, I'm sure we'll cover this extensively, but I would like to point out a few things which I have noticed over the last 40 years I've covered Saudi Arabia. But since we only have 7 minutes or 10 minutes to speak, I've decided to sort of simplify things very broadly and say that basically today I see that in the kingdom we have two major groups which are by the leadership, by the royal family, by some of the senior princes in the royal family. But I've called these two groups the liberals and the conservative, which is of course much too broad to mean very much, but I will spend a little bit of time discussing this. Perhaps I will spend a little more time discussing the liberals, to be getting the short shrift in the discussions on Saudi Arabia usually. The main point I'm making here is that neither of these groups, so neither of the liberals, neither of the conservatives, and the arbiters, the royal family and the senior princes, have any interest in democracy. And I will go into this a little bit more. So let me spend a little time on what I call the liberals. Who are they, basically? One of the scholars in Europe has called what I mean by the liberals the islands of efficiency in the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Basically, it's the civil service who work at Saudi Aramco, SABIC, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Commerce, a lot of the merchants, most of the foreign educated persons, and they're increasing enormously every year. What I call the liberal Wahhabis, which may be a little surprising to many, but who are there and quite in very high positions usually. And of course all the people are close to, in my view, King Abdullah, whom I would situation of the liberals, or this part of the society, the liberals, even though he probably would reject that. But what is common to all these groups is they have a vision of Saudi Arabia to be a world-leading nation. They know that they cannot rely on the military strength of the country, which is on purpose kept very weak, in my view. But it is a group of people who want to develop Saudi Arabia to make it a leading economic power in the world by 2020. They want to depend on the economic strength of the country. It is pushing for moving away from crude oil, and it is, of course, still the largest producer of crude oil in the world, but they're moving away from that. A little statistics on this, which I computed, that today the income of Saudi Arabia just from the chemicals, and they produce many more things than just the chemicals, is higher today than the production of crude oil in terms of dollars, is higher than the crude oil production of 2004. And it's around $50 billion or so. So it's a very, very strong growth into the non-crude oil situation. They view their position and the position of Saudi Arabia as bolstered by the fact that it is a leader in Islam, but they don't want to impose necessarily the Wahhabi, conservative Wahhabi approach to Islam, the Salafi. They view themselves, and the king has said so himself in writing, that he viewed Islam as an all-encompassing religion, a religion of tolerance and whatnot. That may be, for Western consumption. It's also for Iranian consumption, because for many years was wishing to get closer to Iran, and I think that is going to happen in the near future again, of course. There are, of course, very many challenges to this vision. One of them is the fact that, as Christopher has mentioned, unemployment is still very high, especially among the youth. There are major efforts done by the Saudi government to this effect, but the big problem of unemployment from a purely political standpoint, in my view, is that it is splitting the liberal ranks. In other words, many of the civil servants, many of the senior princes on that side, really want to impose the development of Saudi youth being employed. And a lot in society do not want to employ that many Saudis and will use as many excuses as they can find not to do that. Fact is, in my opinion, and experience, I might add, the problem of youth unemployment in Saudi Arabia is complex, but one of the key issues is salaries. The Saudis are not offered proper salaries to start a family, to start working in companies, so they are being accused of not having enough work ethic. The fact is, they have pocketbooks and they have families, and that just doesn't seem to jive with especially the large merchant classes who do not want to pay. They'd rather have Indians or are very qualified, very good, working for a third the price. So this is something which is a bone of contention between the civil service in particular, especially the most advanced civil service, and a lot of the merchant class who really should be working together for the development of that vision to become an industrial power. Of course, as been mentioned by Christopher also, there's a need, if they want to become a major industrial power, as they're becoming one now, they need to be a very modern educational system. And there has been great progress made at the level of universities. The universities have been reformed. They are no longer totally under the thumb of their religious conservatives. There are some universities, there is one university that even has men and women working together. And also, there is, and I have to revise a figure I gave last time I was here, and I was looking at that last night. There are 111,000 Saudi students in the United States alone. And that's from Arab News, April 20th, 2014. A huge number. And this is increasing all the time, and it's not just in the US. A lot of these students go to China, go to Germany, go to Australia, and whatnot. These people come back with very, very big experience of how the world is outside Saudi Arabia. And I think this is a definite policy of the civil servants and the king to bring this kind of more liberal approach to the situation. Now, another issue, of course, is the issue of women. And a lot of the civil servants and a lot of the people in the king's entourage want to bring women into the system. And as you travel to Saudi Arabia, you see that it is happening, but very, very and it's creating a lot of issues. The fact is, these people are working against the Salafis and the more conservative element, and I wouldn't say be stronger than this battle is taking place as we speak. So in terms of the conservatives, of course, who they are, well, they are the traditional Wahhabis, the Muslim Brothers, the Sahwa, the alliance between the Muslim Brothers and the Wahhabis, which Stéphane Lacroix has mentioned so beautifully well in his various books. And, there are a few royals with them, the Mutawa'in of the traditional Wahhabis, and some of the areas in Saudi Arabia are much more friendly to these conservatives, especially the heartland of Burayda in the north and so on. But remember, a lot of the population of Saudi Arabia is not really of the center of Saudi Arabia. The Jeddah, the people from Jeddah, the people from the east coast who are Shia, no, many are Shia, not the majority, but many are Shia. In Yemen, where in the Yemeni borders, in the south, where there are many, many people of different sects, they do not necessarily support, although they may be conservative, they do not necessarily support the Sunni Salafis. But these conservatives are really taking a stand against the educational system, and they're trying to keep the hold they have today on the secondary education and the primary education principally. They also are trying to stop the women from entering the labor force, and of course they want to spread the truth as their truth as conservative Sunni Hanbalis in the world. And they take advantage of their position to do that. Now, faced with these two groups, very destabilizing to the other, the royal family, especially the king, and some of the senior princes are trying to keep peace in the valley.
They love that because it forces them to be the arbiter of the system. If one wins, well, the system goes to hell, because it's going to be, all of a sudden, we get back to being Iraq or Syria or something, not back, we would be Iraq. So the king must navigate between these two very large groups. Now, the king has built a symbiotic relationship with the king. The kings, as well in the past, have built a symbiotic relationship between each of these groups. The liberals need the king and the royal family to promote their vision, the vision I mentioned of being a major industrial power by 2020, et cetera, et cetera. But vice versa, the royal family needs these people because they're the ones who make the money. They run Saudi Aramco, they run SABIC, and so on, and that's where the income is coming from. So they go very badly. At the same time, they also, the conservatives have a symbiotic relationship with the royal family, because without the royal family, they cannot spread the truth, as I mentioned it, throughout the world, because they need the money, and the money comes, by order of the royal family. And they want to make sure that the liberals will not control the system too much, and they need the family to make sure that doesn't happen. Though this symbiotic relationship serves, of course, the senior princes very well, because by playing one against the other, being the arbiters of all, then nobody will question their role. Now, the royal family, of course, and the king has been knows there are pressures for democratization and whatnot, for people wanting, democratization is not the right word, this pressure for participation. And there has been some efforts. The Shura is increasingly strong. They're looking at a lot of issues which 5 years ago they would never have looked at. They also have the king has imposed the fact that there would be 15% women on the Majlis al-Shura. And huge difference. And because they're bringing a lot of topics, and they're not, shrinking violets there, and they really are on the situation to move forward. However, we're not going to go as far as elections, God forbid. And, this is really meant because if there were elections, a lot of people feel the Salafis would win. Now, the Salafis in their term would feel that the liberals would win. So nobody wants elections. It just wouldn't make sense for them. Next year, there'll be one thing where it's liberalized a little bit. Next year, there will be elections for half of the municipality councils, which, of course, have very little power, but the women will be able to vote for the first time. And I think that's going to make a big difference. There are huge efforts to take back the educational system away from the Sahwa. And one of them is this 111,000 students in the US and many more elsewhere. They've taken back the universities from the Salafis, and of course the big battle is still going on for who's going to control the secondary level. So basically, let's look at one of the biggest problems of Saudi today is the succession issue. The king is 92 years old, he's extremely popular, which makes me feel like the liberals, what I call the liberals, it's really, they would fight the word, by the way, these are the same people, very much are in majority, I think, in Saudi Arabia. But the issue is to how the king is going to keep his legacy alive. And the people around him are trying to push this very hard. So they're going to, the view of some scholars is that Prince Mughrin, who is the number 3 now, will carry this vision through. Nobody's too sure about Prince Salman, but that's the big situation today. We don't really know where it's going to go, but it's important to keep King alive, because a lot of people think, and myself included, of course, is that over the years, the Salafis will become totally obsolete. And if you can wait them out without killing them or fighting them, and vice versa, they will disappear on their own. So this totally means there's no interest in democracy, because any kind of democracy would destabilize the region, would destabilize Saudi Arabia. I have a couple more minutes or not?
Another minute.
Okay. So basically, that's what I'm trying to convey to you. One of the issues of Saudi Arabia, which I did not really mention last time I was here, is the military issue. And the way I've been approaching this issue is very simple. Saudi Arabia today I said, is one of the best industrial nations in the world. They have the best, one of the best oil companies, Saudi Aramco. They have among the very best chemical companies, and that's pretty high-tech stuff, whether it's Aramco, SABIC, Ma'aden, people of this nature. Unbelievable. SABIC is the second largest chemical company in the world today. And, when this, and it's 85 to 89% Saudi. It's managed by the Saudi, engineers are Saudi, et cetera, et cetera. So why can't they have a decent military? We as Americans have trained them for 50 years. We've sold them over $400 billion worth of equipment. They have better equipment than most European nations, and they can't fight. And when they look at us, we are the ones supposed to go do the dirty work in Iraq and Syria. Why can't they do it? Well, because their military is not strong enough. Why is it not strong enough is a big question. Now, it has been kept inefficient on purpose, is my view, because it is controlled by the royal family, and it is in the interest of no one to have the military too strong, because then it could perhaps take over. And that is, as long as we have the U.S. to fight for the Saudis, then, who cares? So that is a big issue. And so I'll leave it at that. But the conclusion basically is that the country has visions that are opposed to each other, and the royal and the leadership, not just the royal family, is in between the two, using that to stay in power and keeping it for the future, and hoping that each one is hoping that the others will collapse in the future. That's where I am.
Okay, thank you very much for those observations, and now we'll hear from Karen Elliott-House.
All right. There was a column about 10 days ago by a Saudi professor in Jeddah who describes an American family in a shopping mall in Saudi Arabia, and they are approached by one of the religious police, and the two women have their heads uncovered. The gentleman, speaking very good English, says to the women, please cover your heads. The daughter objects, and so the religious policeman says to her, but you will be so much prettier with your head covered. I'll show you, and offers to take her picture, which she gets into this, covers her head, he takes her photo, they're all happily chuckling with each other, and then the ladies say to him, why are you different from all the other religious policemen? And he says, you can just call me the cool sheikh. And I think what this story illustrates is that reform is more an anecdote than anything ingrained in Arabia. So I'm going to try to address the why progress on reform, despite 8 or 9 years of King Abdullah talking about it, and obviously some decades of modest talk about reform prior to that. And in my view, the answer is the Saudi royal family does not actually want much reform. And the second reason is the people of Saudi Arabia don't want much reform. It is still a conservative society. I don't disagree with what he said about the tug of war, or the growing tug of war between moderates and religious conservatives. It does exist, and it does suit the royal family to walk down the balance beam between them, because whatever they want to do, they can then say, yes, we wish we could do more, but look at the conservatives, we can't. Or we wish we could do less to the conservatives, but you see, you hear all these people demanding this and that. So it's and it is a society, I think it's important for people. It's not like the old Soviet Union where people are ruled by fear. It is very much a society in which the royal family prefers to buy and bribe people, not beat them. If it is necessary, they will get tough, but it's not the preferred method. So over the history of the country, promises of reform, at least in my view, always exceed the realities. So you get the basic law, you get the promise of a Shura Council. There is a Shura Council, but without meaning to insult anyone, it's about as useful as the United Nations. It's a debating society. So people, and that's not unuseful to have people have an opportunity to speak in public on issues that at one point in time were more private, but it is not a place where they're debating political reform, I assure you. Having been allowed to visit the Shura Council, and it is clearly good that there are women in the Shura Council now, but they too are part of a group that can only recommend, and what recommendations, accept them, amend them, ignore them, is entirely them. So what you get from much of the talk about reform, whether it's the national dialogues in the 2003, 4, 5 time, those dialogues were intended to suck the political dialogue out of the country by focusing people on the role of women, the role of youth, the other, meaning Shia. And what you get in the end is a big new building. So there's a big, beautiful Shura Council, there's a big, beautiful dialogues building, but there's not a lot that changes on the ground. Moving on to the concerned people, it is absolutely true that you can meet a lot of moderate, well-educated businessmen, intellectuals, etc., but they're not the majority in the country. And most of those, to echo Jean-Francois, do not want democracy. There are a few people that want democracy, but most people simply want better governance. They want less corruption, more accountability, more transparency, but they're not really asking for the right to vote because, as has already been said, the municipal councils don't have any real power. And what is given can be taken away. When those elections occurred in 2005, they were supposed to reoccur in 2009. They did not. After the Arab Spring in 2011, when the government needed some bones to throw to the people, they the elections again in 2015, and maybe they will, and maybe they won't. One will stay tuned. I think that there have been, is seriously interested in education reform. There has been more progress on education reform and the role of women in the country than any other areas of reform. But one of the issues that at least Saudis raise is whether this bold new mixed university outside of Jeddah that cost so much money and that was built by Aramco education enterprise in Saudi Arabia, which the king hoped, he said at least, to reform through this example of a better and more modern university, is whether that survives the king's death. Saudis deeply resent that so much money is being spent on that institution, which is still largely populated by foreign men and women, not Saudi men and women. And the king, I think, has been very sincere in seeking to give women the opportunity to use their talents more. And in my view, there has been more progress on the role of women, frankly, even in education, because I visited a lot of universities and schools when I was working on the book. And as the gentleman who was in charge of redoing the textbooks to allegedly clean up some of the Wahhabi excesses said, when you close the classroom door, what the teacher does in class, only he or she knows, unless it's reported out by their children. And there are numerous Saudis I've talked to whose children apparently go home and do tell them, "Daddy, you're wrong. I'm too old," says the 11-year-old girl. "My teacher says to have a male Arabic teacher. Me someone else." Or the young girl who goes home and says, I should cover your head, Mom. That's what my teacher says. So it really seen how much actually changes on the education. On the reform front, clearly things are going backwards as the margin for free speech that had increased a bit, at least in my view, in the 2005 to 9 period, has been rolled back. I think the government feels insecure now with the succession battles going on, with Iran breathing all over the Middle East, with these Arab Spring sentiments, with the U.S. a reliable partner, and now, of course, ISIS. So they do not feel secure enough to allow much margin for conversation among political activists, and as most of you know, the human rights activists have been locked up over the last 12 to 24 months. And as Human Rights Watch observed in, I think, their latest report, the newly gained freedoms are for the most part neither nor firmly grounded. The limited reform that has taken place suggests that still floating trial balloons, undecided about the type of government and society it wants to steer toward. I do think that the turmoil in the rest of the Middle East is certainly giving the regime a significant reprieve. Saudis, at least when I was last there in June, seem to be saying to themselves, while this country isn't the moderates, everything we would like, at least we're not killing each other like Egypt and Syria and Libya and to a certain extent Tunisia. So I think the real issue is what happens when King Abdullah dies, who has been a force for a bit of moderation. But I think Saudi Arabia is a country that, like the founder of the Umayyad dynasty said when asked how he survived so long, when the Muhammad's early successors all tended to not last very long. He said, "I hold a hair between myself and my people. When they pull, I yield. When they yield, I pull." And I think that is about the extent for reform in Saudi Arabia, because it so far is pleasing to both the royal family and to the bulk of the population, because you do have some that want to go back 1,400 years and some that would like to move forward to become like Malaysia. That's the definition I constantly hear of what this modern Saudi Arabia would look like Malaysia. Thanks.
Thank you very much for those comments. And you raise a provocative question about what Saudi society wants, and they want better governance, more transparency, more accountability. Of course, the question of what sort of steps need to be taken to get to those values. With that, move to Bernard Haykel, who talk about Saudi Arabia beyond its borders in the region.
Thank you again for this invitation. So I've been tasked with Saudi Arabia and policies, democracy, if I can. It's clear, I think, that Saudi Arabia has led a counter-revolutionary set of with respect to the various countries around it. I don't know whether democracy figures in, though, in its thinking or in its calculation with respect to the policies it has pursued. Let's begin on some of the things that Saudi Arabia has insisted on in its policies. I think it was clearly paramount. The survival of the regime is an important consideration. It phrases it in terms of wanting stability, both domestically and in the region. It also, this king and the regime itself has often emphasized personal ties to individuals. There's shock, I think, within in the royal, the way in which President Mubarak dismissed, the fact that the United States, and in particular President Obama, seem to not have any loyalty to this man who had served the interests of the United States fairly faithfully for a long time. So the abandonment of the American administration of the Egyptian president was a problem for them. With respect to its policies in the region, the question that arises is whether Saudi Arabia pursues an ideological agenda. And I don't think it does, actually. I think that it pursues a policy that is quite distinct regarding different countries. So let me begin with Bahrain. And on the 14th of February 2011, Bahrain seemed to erupt in a revolution population who are Shia against the minority regime that rules that island country. The Saudis were very adamant then and are still adamant now that the regime is not to be toppled. It sees Bahrain as a country that could easily fall under the sway of the Iranian regime and the forces of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and that would be wholly unacceptable. So they pushed influence in both military as well as financial to prop up the regime, and that is just the way it's going to be. There's no way Bahrain will ever, as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, will ever become a Shiite-ruled country, whether democratically or otherwise. The Saudis also, looking at the East, are confronted and have been confronted, perhaps now less, by Qatar. Qatar is a small thumb that sticks off of the Arabian Peninsula and has pursued that is quite idiosyncratic and very troubling for the Saudis. I can get into why Qatar has behaved in this way. It has promoted the Muslim Brotherhood principally throughout the Arab Spring uprisings, and has, since the fall of Libya, Qataris have been funding Saudi opposition, the Saudi Islamist opposition to the regime in Riyadh, as if the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power in Riyadh would not, in fact, represent a threat to Qatar itself. This has been very troubling to the Saudis, and they've put considerable pressure on the Qataris on this policy. And it seems that there are hints or inklings that the Qataris have chosen to at least not push so hard on the accelerator with respect to the Muslim Brotherhood. With now 7 Muslim Brotherhood leaders having left Qatar or about to leave Qatar to go to Istanbul and Turkey, which is likely to become the new headquarters for the Muslim Brotherhood in the region and in the world. Now, this case of Qatar, and this is just a little parenthetical kind of comment, the fact that Qatar, which itself is not by any stretch of the imagination a democracy, should be pushing and funding for what seem to be democratic changes in the region, underscores that many of these petrostates that are represented in the Arabian/Persian Gulf, these states may pursue policies that seem to be democratic, but in fact they're not rooted in that desire for democracy necessarily to emerge. They have their own agendas. And in the Qatari case, the agenda seems to have been basically to just poke the eye of the Saudis for reasons to do with Saudi-Qatari tensions and rivalries that date several decades back, if not longer. Turning to Iran. Again, there's no question that the Saudis see Iran as an aggressive power with imperial ambitions that is in the domination of Iraqi politics, Syrian politics, Lebanese politics, potentially Bahrain, and certainly in Yemen with the Houthi rebellion. And this, again, from a Saudi perspective, is wholly unacceptable. They see Iran as meddling in internal Arab affairs and with an agenda that is aggressively anti-Saudi and against the regime, with the aim of perhaps toppling the regime in Riyadh. And so the Saudis are pursuing policies that seek to roll back this Iranian influence in the region. The way in which you roll back Iranian influence in the region is to point to the fact that Sunnis have been disenfranchised politically for many decades now. The Assad regime has come to power in Syria, but certainly since the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. And this Sunni disenfranchisement in what is called the Bilad al-Sham, the northern areas of north of Arabia, is something that resonates deeply with the Saudi population. So here we have a situation where the Saudi ruling family and government are on the same page with their own population with respect to trying to reverse this disenfranchisement of Sunnis. Now, the form by which you reverse the disenfranchisement, what policies you are to pursue, here there is a debate. Do you support the non-Salafi but Islamist opposition in Syria, or do you support the Salafis who may have only nationalist ambitions and not regional ambitions? What is your view and policy vis-a-vis ISIS, the Islamic State, in Iraq and Syria? These are questions that are debated, I think, at the highest circles within the Saudi royal family and government. And there's a division of opinion on the matter because whether we like it or not, many Sunnis, whether in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere, feel that the present situation in Iraq and in Syria and even in Lebanon is, and something has to be done about it. So there is a response by the regime for this desire. And in that regard, U.S. involvement in the region, especially U.S. bombing ISIS or the Islamic State's troops and positions, is regarded by many in Saudi Arabia as counterproductive. I've just come back from Saudi Arabia, and many Saudis have said that America's bombing of ISIS, in fact, only further bolsters ISIS's of what is of who the enemy is. It helps recruitment, and it confirms the narrative in one very particular way, and which is something that many Sunnis in the region fear, namely that the United States will strike an alliance with the minorities of the region, that is the Shiites, the Christians, the Jews in Israel, and this alliance of minorities will be such that it will perpetuate this disenfranchisement and weakening of Sunnis, Sunni Arabs, for many decades to come, and ensure a Shia hegemony over an arc that runs from Tehran all the way to Beirut. I can say more about ISIS if you want in the question and answer period, because it is both a symbol of something for Sunnis, but it's also clearly a threat to the Saudi royal family, given the enmity that ISIS has repeatedly expressed towards the Saudi rulers. it seems to me when looking at the Sunnis, we have two poles that are emerging, and I'll get to Egypt in a minute. I've lost track of time. All right. There are two poles that seem to be emerging in the Sunni world, with Turkey hosting the Muslim Brotherhood, and another axis that involves Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and perhaps, and certainly the UAE, and perhaps Qatar, but that's not clear. So the Sunnis will be divided along this division, and that doesn't bode well for them, because their division will, I think, play into the hands of the Iranians as rivals in the region. Now, let me turn to Egypt for a second. In Egypt, the policy has not been responsive to necessarily to a Saudi popular will. The response to Egypt was basically a response to an ideological and political rival that is represented by the Muslim Brotherhood. The rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the Muslim Brotherhood dates back to at least 1990, when the Muslim Brotherhood betrayed Saudi Arabia by siding largely with Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait. The Muslim Brotherhood is an ideological threat, both in terms of the content of its ideology, with respect to Islam and the nature of Islamic rule. The Muslim Brotherhood also represents another threat, which is, let's call it a processual threat, which is that the Muslim Brotherhood wants to come to power through elections and through forms of political engagement and participation that the Saudis don't necessarily want to approve of. So the Muslim Brotherhood represents a threat to the Saudis at multiple levels, and it is clear that the Saudis want to see the Muslim Brothers out of power, whether in Egypt or elsewhere. So the Saudis backed the military coup against the Muslim Brotherhood and have since promised and perhaps even given $20+ billion along with the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait to Egypt. This to me strikes me as an endless or bottomless black hole that will suck wealth from the Gulf countries, and much of it perhaps going into to corruption and not to the Egyptian people. But the policy towards Egypt is one of an ad hoc, very quick decision that the Saudis have made. They're not known for making decisions very quickly. In fact, they've often been very slow at deciding anything at all. But with respect to Egypt, as with respect to some of the policies they adopted domestically and towards Bahrain, the Saudis were very, very quick. And I'm not sure how much deliberation has gone into that decision, which is coupled, by the way, with the banning of the Muslim Brotherhood domestically, labeling it a terrorist organization. And it is clear that within Saudi Arabia, the Muslim Brotherhood has significant support from Saudis. So that is something I think to watch out for going forward. Now, let me end by saying that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has endless resources to throw at many of its problems, whether domestic or regional, because of the price of oil and because of the reserves that have accumulated, which are between $700 and $1 trillion now. This is a luxury and leads to a certain amount of arrogance, perhaps, a sense of security, especially as both the speakers earlier mentioned, but especially Karen mentioned that given the chaos that surrounds Saudi Arabia all over, whether in Yemen or Iraq or Syria or Libya or even Egypt and the Sinai, the Saudis don't want to see that happening at home, and that's natural. So given that fear of chaos, which they see all around them, and the fact that the regime, the government, has endless resources to throw at most of its problems to buy social peace and even to project influence into the region and power into the region, the Saudis will pursue these policies. And at times, they may seem contradictory, depending on which country and which issue that the kingdom is is interested in engaging or in pursuing. So there's no neat narrative to describe what the Saudis have been up to around the region. And this, I think, can be shown clearly where, for instance, in Iraq, they want Sunnis to have greater participation and greater role in governance. So they would want something like more democracy in Iraq, with the Sunnis being empowered or given more power. Certainly for Syria, they would want democracy because the Sunnis would come to power. But in Egypt, they don't want that, and nor do they want that in Bahrain. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. Just one question before we open it up to the audience. Thinking to one of the key aspects of the Arab uprisings, which was, at least in many people's view, a desire for more responsive governance, many of the qualities that you mentioned, Karen, in the Saudi context, that haven't really been met of the cases where the uprising started, including in Egypt. If we look at Saudi Arabia and the slow pace of reform and the inability of the authorities to generate more responsiveness and accountable governance and methods for combating corruption, what does that say about the coming term? Perhaps both you and Jean-Francois can comment on this, the prospects for maintaining stability, because this always seems to be the paramount value and word that the authorities put forth. But listening to all the panelists speak, one gets the unsettling feeling that the stability is very fragile. And so I just wonder if one views better governance, more transparency, more accountability, or at least incrementally, or some process to get towards that goal. What are the prospects for achieving that, given the existing set of factors that have just been set forth, which suggest the prospects for enormous?
Well,
First.
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
You know, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. And I think that's really, that's from my point of view, I think that's the answer to your question. I think that Saudi Arabia, people are so worried about what's happening in the rest of the region that they know that everything is very unstable all around them, and they don't want to bring it to Saudi Arabia. They're perfectly willing to live with the corruption. By the way, the corruption, in my view, is only at certain levels. It's not. It's certainly not true among most of the civil servants. It's certainly not true among the main powers like SABEC and Saudi Aramco and so on. It's certainly true in the Ministry of Defense. But I think people are very much aware that if one or the other of the Salafis or the more modern-minded people in Saudi Arabia win, create instability. So they'd rather, I think, live with that stability, even though it's far from being perfect for all.
Yeah. I find when you talk to Saudis, I mean, they're all happy. Most of them are happy to complain, either because things are too liberal or are not liberal enough. But fundamentally, I think Saudis want predictability above almost everything. So while I heard a lot of talk about transparency and unhappiness among young people that at what they regard as the government wasting their money, is who get, and I can't get land, I can't afford land to build a house on, or a lot of these new universities were built at enormous cost. And this is in the press, and it's also, if it's not in the press, it's on social media, and people regard that as there went $10 billion of my money up in smoke, so to speak, or into someone's pocket. And they don't really like the young people, by and large, the idea of going to some prince to beg for this or that. We say, it's my right. I shouldn't have to ask. So I think that sentiment is likely to remain, but it's always been my view that the royal family, with actually a bit more control over the family itself, could satisfy most of people's demands, because and certainly right now there is enormous patience, because people don't want, as we keep saying, they don't want upheaval in the country. But so they're now, hoping that someone in the royal family itself will step up and succeed at creating a slightly more accountable, more predictable government. So even the people on the far edge seem to only be saying maybe we could have a prime minister who's not a royal. I personally don't see that happening, because I think if you have a prime minister who's not a royal, if you say this is the best man to be prime minister, people then start to say, well, if some ordinary man is the best man to be prime minister, what do we need all of the royals for? But, that's from the people I've dealt with, at least that's kind of the most extreme demand of or request of most people. Again, not democracy, with very few exceptions.
Thank you. So why don't we open it up for questions? I'll keep a list. I kindly ask that you identify yourself and keep your questions as succinct as you're able. So why don't we start with the gentleman here. There's a microphone coming. Yep.
My name is Safi Hamid. I'm with the Center for Egyptian-American Relations. And I've been acquainted with Saudi Arabia for the last 40 years of my life. And my question is for, first of all, thank you all, very enlightening perspectives. For actually Jean-Francois and Karen, this couple questions, very briefly. I think I heard that you are saying that if things left alone, the Salafi and the Wahhabi movements or ideology will be retreating and declining. I see a paradox, because I have seen in the last 4 decades investment in the infrastructure of this ideology by building huge universities, all Islamic universities, which are very hardcore Salafis, and these people have graduated tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of clergy, really ingrained in that. So I don't know how can we expect decline or withdrawal. The other one, of course, is related to the road to democracy. We were taught, and we know from history, the road to democracy has to at least pass by stops like transparency and cultural desire for transparency and for accountability, which I don't know if we see that in the culture or even in the public discourse. Thank you.
Well, very briefly, I think I agree with you on the road to democracy. The increasing transparency and accountability is not happening, and is not likely to happen anytime soon. I don't think anyone really, they know the price they would have to pay to do that, and that's pretty much, in essence, what I was saying earlier. On your point about my saying that the Salafis sooner or later will be retreating, I think it's a question of, and I agree, they have built some huge universities, and not only in Saudi Arabia, and not only universities, that are promoting very hardcore beliefs. And that is really, a lot of this has been part of this division, of this symbiotic relationship, where the more conservative get money from through the royal family in order to be given
gifts, if you like, to sort of keep quiet, and they want a university because the Salafists think, well, in turn, if they have that, then it will grow to become very important. On the other hand, the vast majority of the young people do not necessarily believe in what these hardcore people are saying. So I think there's a battle going on, and frankly, I have no inside knowledge or Pew Research Institute studies telling me that in the end they will lose. That's my Karen?
I think there is a lot of, there are a lot more religious voices available to young Saudis today than there used to be, but I wouldn't be quick to write off the Salafi segment of Saudi society. And I guess I disagree. I don't see what the price, I don't see why there's such a high price to the society, maybe to some and individuals in the royal family, but why there's such a high price to a bit more accountability. I mean, they're not the only country that needs more accountability. It's become very popular in this country to say, as Roger Goodall is saying now, oh my goodness, I've messed up on the football players, but I'm sorry, and then go right on. I mean, that's what they don't actually in Saudi Arabia bother to say I messed up, but they're not held accountable when things don't work or when there are huge cost overruns, policies don't work. And I repeat, it is not a unique thing. We're a society too now where no one is held accountable. They simply apologize and move forward. But I don't believe there would be such huge cost. I don't see what the big cost to society would be of somewhat greater transparency. Here's what and there is some move a little bit in Saudi Arabia. There's more government contracts and content on the internet for people to look at, but it is not yet, it's far, far from any genuine transparency, because it is easier if you have control to not have anyone know what you're doing. So I agree that it's not likely to change. I don't agree that there's a big high price to the society of more transparency. I think quite the opposite.
I just wanted to say, that transparency and accountability and good Islamic values. And in fact, you do have Islamist thinkers and ideologues who are writing about this in Saudi Arabia. They're being punished for writing about this. I mean, some of them are in prison. So, the mark of any effective authoritarian regime is the ability to convince its people that the alternative to the regime is chaos, right, is disorder. And that the Saudis have been able to do, the Saudi royal family has been able to do, largely also because of what's happening in the region. And they have not been willing to make sufficient gestures in the Islamic area of better accountability and better governance. And I think that the reason for that is because they're afraid of what these steps would mean for their, for the nature of their rule, and also because they can afford not to make these gestures, given how much money they have, given the chaos in the region, and because people don't do hard things unless they're absolutely forced to, and they're not being forced to do those.
Thank you. So there are a whole set of people on the list here. What I'd like to do is maybe take 3 questions at a time, and we'll gather them and we'll have responses and we'll go back. So let's start here, and then we have 2 over here. Let's start in the front, Melissa. Then we'll go.
I'm Manaz Afghani, Women's Learning Partnership. My first question is, am I right that what you're saying, basically all 3, is that the opposition from inside is not a danger right now to the government of Saudi Arabia, but the fragility is there, and that fragility is because of the interrelationship between the potential successors and the way the system works internally between the royals, that fragility still exists. That's one question. The other is that there seems to be a long-standing process of the supporting and expanding schools, madrasas, not only all over the Muslim majority world, but also in immigrant communities in the West. And although by Saudi principles, these may not all be very radical, but by the rest of the world standards, these are hotbeds of radicalism, Islamism. Is there any kind of a conversation, any kind of attempting to coax the Saudis or understand or have them explain why are they doing this? The external, how is it to their thinking affecting the internal, or what is the purpose of all this and how dangerous is it really? Thank you.
And then Radwan and then...
Good afternoon. My name is Radwan Masmoudi with the Center for the Study of Democracy. Thank you for excellent presentations, but I must say I found them very depressing on two levels. First, on the internal domestic level, to be talking about stability under repression, it's as if we have not learned any lessons from recent history, and specifically from the Arab Springs. In 2010, everybody thought Ben Ali was stable. Mubarak and Gaddafi, certainly nobody challenged them. They were stable. And yet in 2 or 3 weeks or few weeks, they were forced to leave. And that shows that there is a lot of anger and frustration in all these countries under this so-called stability. So it's very depressing to see Saudi Arabia basically not doing anything in terms of reforms, because it tells me that the explosion is coming. That the people of Saudi Arabia, and I met many young people of Saudi Arabia, 30% unemployment in Saudi Arabia, that the explosion is coming. Secondly, and more scary to me, or more depressing to me, is what they are doing to the region. Basically, Saudi Arabia now is leading the Arab winter, is leading the counter-revolution against the democratic changes and aspirations of an entire region, just so that they can go back to their people and say, democracy doesn't work. See, it's not stable. And so they are leading military coups and violent groups and everything to show that democracy doesn't work. And this is extremely harmful. This is going to destroy the region. This is going to not bring any kind of stability or democracy. It's just going to make it chaotic throughout the region. So do they not see the danger? And more importantly, do we not see the danger here in Washington or in Western Europe? To let Saudi Arabia do this to the Arab world, I think is criminal. Thank you.
We can just go right here.
My name is Amin Mahmoud, Center for Egyptian-American Relations. And I would like to ask Bernard about how long Saudi Arabia can sustain giving money to Egypt, and Egypt have a lot of opposition inside the really will draw a lot of money. Nobody can sustain 90 million people who majority is against the coup, against the regime who been killing people and so on. That's one thing. What is the relation between Saudi Arabia and Israel?
Saudi Arabia.
Israel. You want to start with the third question?
Yeah, I mean, I can start on Saudi Arabia and Israel. There are no formal relations, obviously, and they may see eye to eye on some issues in the region. I think for a while, perhaps they both saw Iran as a threat, but the fact that they converge, their interests might converge on some policies or some matters, does not mean that they're working in cahoots with one another, or they're in alliance with one another. There are some unofficial Saudis, that is Saudis who are not in government, who have been permitted to meet with the Israelis at conferences and so on. But I can't speak for any unofficial, behind the scenes contacts or communication. I don't know whether they exist or they don't. The Saudi people, I don't think, would take to an open, alliance or an open coordination of policies between Riyadh and Israel. As far as how long they can sustain Egypt, I mean, it depends how much Egypt needs. If we're talking about $20 billion a year, the Saudis can sustain it for a very long time because they have those resources. But I really don't know what Egypt will need in terms of actual funding in the long term. Regarding Saudi, you called their policies criminal. I'm not sure. I think you're perhaps being, overly, I don't know if overly critical, or you're using very strong language. I think the advantage of certain situations. They did not topple the regime in Egypt, but they saw an opportunity in that. On Syria, their policy, as far as being anti-Assad, I would think is probably a very good thing, and has been a good thing, in terms of trying to bring down one of the most brutal dictators in the world. So the record is not a simple, a simple one, and that's what I tried to explain in my comments. That it's not just a one policy, one size fits all policy towards the region. On some issues, I think the Saudis are right. The Sunnis in Iraq and in Syria ought to be given enfranchisement. They ought to be given a greater say in how they're ruled. On Egypt, their policy is wrong, and I think a lot of Saudis would agree with you. On Egypt, their policy is wrong. I imagine their policy also on Tunisia is wrong. So I think a bit more nuance is necessary. Lastly, there are two more points very quickly. As far as the explosion and when is it coming, it's very hard to know. It's very hard to predict. Social media is an extremely important tool now. The Saudis are more informed and more critical than they've ever been as a population. They're the biggest consumers of YouTube, I think, on the planet. There could be a trigger. A woman gets abused in the street. There's a film of this by the religious police and so on. That could trigger something that could mobilize people. If 100,000 young, frustrated men came out into the street trying to demonstrate and they were shot, or many were killed, that could then snowball into something much more difficult, and that would test the regime if it had to shoot at its own people. And I'm not sure what the Saudi regime would do, both whether it would give the command to shoot at its own people and whether its own troops would shoot at its own people. They may not obey such orders. So, those would all be test cases. And again, I don't know when and if the explosion is going to happen. I think it will, but the price of oil is one factor, what's going on in the region is another, and so on. And whether you have that trigger event. Lastly, the madrasa question that you had asked about. So you see, the Saudis, first of all, Salafism is a very broad movement. So most of them are not political or not interested in politics, or at the very least, they argue that obedience to the ruler is a requirement, is a requirement of a believer. So this particular group, the obedient types, are the majority of Salafis, and or Wahhabis, and they're the ones that the Saudis have been promoting throughout the region. So if you were to go, let's say, to Philadelphia, there are 3 Salafi mosques in Philadelphia. All of them are completely obedient, apolitical types of Salafis. They're radical only in the sense of how they interpret texts. But we have literalists amongst Christians too, and they're not dangerous. So just because you're Salafi, just because you're receiving Saudi funding, does not necessarily mean that you're dangerous politically. What ends up being dangerous is something much more complicated. It's very difficult to predict again.
I think there is a fragility because there's a tendency to to confuse stability with stagnation. I think personally Saudi Arabia is a stagnant country right now, and that does make it, for the reasons Bernard was just saying, no one knows what could prompt some emotional outcry, and whether the Saudi military forces would do what they did when Saud and Faisal have the religious say to the family, you guys work this out, our sons aren't going to die. So, but I think the bigger problem in the short run with this country and Saudi Arabia is going to be the more we pursue this ISIS policy, the worse U.S.-Saudi relations are going to get, because we have a half-hearted plan, and there's going to be a lot of focus on, well, now, wait a minute, ISIS, we're fighting these people because they're Sunnis and they're beheading people. Now, how many people did Saudi Arabia behead last year? And we're fighting the ISIS because they drive Christians and Yazidis out of the area. Didn't the Saudis just arrest 28 Christians, and, you know, what happened to them? I mean, it's going to become harder and harder to separate what our objectives are from the people that we're trying to get to help pursue those objectives. And Saudi Arabia, I think, is going to be, for all the reasons Bernard mentioned earlier, there is a problem for the Saudi government to be too anti-ISIS, because there are a lot of Saudis who do think the Shia need to be cut down to size in Iraq. So it's going to be very hard for them, and it's going to be very hard for us to sustain this under the public light glare of exactly understanding what's the difference between what ISIS wants and what the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia wants in its brand of Islam. The king says all the right things, but the actions in the country will confuse Americans.
Having a confused American policy is nothing in the region. I would say that one of the points which Radwan made, really, which actually bothered me, is one of your questions was, what do we do about it? You know, what do the Americans do about it? Well, we do nothing about it because it is not our business. And I think one of the solutions, really, truly, is we've made enough mistakes in the past in the Gulf in general, the invasion of Iraq for one. Do we want to actually push the Saudis to do things one way or the other? Let me say something to you all. I think that in spite of everything that has been mentioned, even by Bernard, who's really the top person in this country, I think there is a lot of commonality between Iran and Saudi Arabia today. And ISIS is the chance to take advantage of this, in the sense that both Iran and Saudi Arabia have the same interest in getting rid of ISIS. And if we have to do anything, is maybe to push Iran and Saudi Arabia to work together. Now, the king of Saudi Arabia, when he first became king, his first abroad was to Iran. And he has systematically been talking about Islam as an all-encompassing religion of tolerance, which was a sign, as I said in my little speech earlier, which was a sign to the Iranians that it's time to talk. Now, a lot of people in Saudi Arabia are totally opposed to that because, you know, a good Shia is a dead Shia for many. But on the other hand, there's also a whole group of people who'd like to see a more unification of the Sunnis and Shia together. Now, I think the king is very much behind that. If we, as the U.S., refuse the pressures from various lobbies in Washington to just do nothing with Iran, you know, and we try to work with Iran, we try to negotiate a deal with Iran, then the Saudis can also negotiate
a deal with Iran. And I think that will be the end of ISIS, because at that point, it is not just the US attacking all Sunnis. It's the Saudis and the Iranians, Muslims, attacking some totally unacceptable movement in the region.
So why don't we take the next round of questions if we can. I have Frank, and then the gentleman on the aisle, and then Matar, and then we'll take another three.
Hello, I'm Frank Alzan. I'm going to be very brief. I'm confused because the last speaker said that the U.S. should do nothing. And then you turn around and you said the U.S. should be negotiating with Iran. So maybe I'm not as nuanced as some of the people around here, but I don't understand that. I think that doing nothing is doing something. And we have seen that all over the world, particularly having to do with human rights. And my original question was, I heard the panel say that the Saudis feel that they can retreat in the region. And at the same time, I heard that the Saudis were against bombings somewhere in the region. Again, maybe someone could clarify those things for a very, very confused Cuban here.
So that we'll go to the gentleman here.
Stuart Rosenblatt. I work with Executive Intelligence Review. My question is for all three panelists. The U.S. Congress has a bill in front of it right now to declassify a chapter of the original 9/11 report, which purports, according to the people who've read the report, and that includes Senator Bob Graham, who chaired the commission, that it purports to blame factions in Libya, including as high up as Bandar bin Sultan, the then ambassador, and the Saudi consulate, at least in California, for being directly involved in at least providing material and other support for the hijackers. Needless to say, this has picked up a lot of steam recently. CNN, MSNBC, Fox have all done big stories on it. Senator Bob Graham is demanding that the pages be declassified. They've been classified by both Bush and Obama. On top of that, the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission, Tom Keene, former governor of New Jersey, and Lee Hamilton, former congressman, have both demanded that it be declassified. So my question, given that the U.S. has now got this crazy thing going where the Saudis are going to, quote, be involved in or at least sponsoring or helping to train, quote, moderate Syrian rebels, or as one congressman told me last week, the only moderate Syrian rebels he knows of are in Jordan. But given that they're going to be trained in Saudi Arabia, wouldn't it behoove us to declassify this, get at these Saudi involvement? So my question is, would you support the declassification?
And let's take one more from, and we'll take another round.
My name is Matar Ibrahim Matar, former MP from Bahrain. My question is to Mr. Seznec. Regarding Saudi policy toward Bahrain, it's clear that the idea of overthrowing the regime in Bahrain maybe is threatening for Saudis, but it doesn't seem they're getting advantage of wide repression against Bahrainis or wide Bahraini. My question is, what is the maximum that Saudis can see it possible in Bahrain that doesn't threat their position and can bring stability in Bahrain?
Okay. Do you want to start with that one?
Yes, I probably should start, and I apologize for being so voluble and say we should do nothing. That was in fact too strong. Thank you for pointing this out. But when I say that we should do nothing, what I'm saying is we should not be involved in Syria. That's what I mean by doing nothing. On the other hand, if it means trying to gently prod the Saudis and the Iranians to work together, and mostly by us making a deal with the Iranians so that the Saudis can do it, that's really what I meant to say. So I apologize for being too strong-minded on that. On the declassification, I just cannot comment on that. I don't know. But on Bahrain, as you probably know, I'm very close to Bahrain, and I've had a few issues myself in Bahrain. So it's very hard for me to give an opinion because I'm far from being objective on this issue. But I think a problem of Bahrain with Saudi Arabia is that I think Saudi Arabia views Bahrain as whatever it is, the 17th province of Saudi Arabia, and absolutely has no respect for the Bahraini royal family. They just tell them, take care of it. You know, we don't want the Iranians to come through, take care of it. So the family in Bahrain controls, not unlike in Saudi Arabia, the family in Bahrain controls the politics and they control the economics, totally. And so they act against the Shia majority and against the Sunni opposition very, very strongly. And the Saudis let it happen. It truly is not their problem. At one point, I was trying to work with some opposition members in Bahrain to try to figure out how do we get the Saudis to understand that the Shia opposition in Bahrain is Arab and not Iranian. You know, the Saudis know it, but you have to say that to the right people. And I could never find out who was in charge of Bahraini policy in Saudi Arabia. To this day, I haven't found out. So I think what's happening is that no one's in charge, in fact, of the Bahraini policy, and it's just, you know, we have subcontracted this to the Al-Khalifas. It's their problem.
I will not surprisingly answer your declassification question. I think absolutely the 28 pages should be declassified. When the two chairmen of the committee that produced it say there's no national security issue, and at least I have read that Prince Bandar had to be declassified, saying I can't defend myself against something that is just rumor. So I don't see any reason not to declassify it, and I must say I'm shocked, if for no other reason, that the fact that George Bush classified that Obama would continue to. So there's something weird about it, but it ought to be declassified.
I mean, I think the implication of your question is whether the Saudis were behind 9/11, the Saudi government. And that strikes me as kind of absurd, because the Al-Qaeda is an avowed enemy of the Saudi state, had been since at least 1994 in the case of bin Laden when he was expelled and stripped of his nationality. What the Saudis would have possibly gained from the destruction of the Twin Towers and, you know, the Pentagon and so on, is unfathomable. And that 15 of the 19 hijackers would have been Saudis, and that they would have had links to the Saudi consulate, maybe even getting money from the Saudi consulate, which is a thing that Saudi students do when they're in this country, strikes me as, quite normal. But that the Saudi government should have known about them and supported them and promoted them and wanted this to happen is beggars belief, really.
I agree with that, but that's the reason to put it out.
Yeah, I mean, it should be put out.
Okay, near agreement. So let's take the gentleman here. He had a question here, and we'll do that.
There's a lady all the way.
Yeah.
Hi, Dominic Malone, American University. If you were advising Ned's management, what kind of democracy promotion programs would you recommend for Saudi Arabia, if any?
Tariq Al-Wazir from the Yemen Heritage and Research Center. My question to Bernard, how about Yemen? You didn't mention much, although now there is an incredulous success of the Houthis that are governing in Sana'a. I want to know what's the billions of dollars of Saudi Arabia that has spent has gone down the drain, I think.
This is Melih Shahab from Saudi Arabia. In this session, a reform word has been so much. And if I'm not in Saudi Arabia, I would think Saudi Arabia is a heaven and I should go there. A reform word has been used for more than 50 years in Saudi Arabia. And more than 50 years, after more than 50 years, there is not only any real kind of reform, but also the dictatorship is getting worse, human rights abuse is getting worse, and even in economic terms, the unemployment high, poverty is getting worse. So for Saudi people, with all this fact, are convinced that the change, a real change, is an achievable goal in Saudi Arabia. So now they are dreaming and they want a real change. So it is disturbing for Saudi people to hear current and former U.S. officials uprising royal family, Saudi royal family, and the system in Saudi Arabia. They couldn't understand why the U.S. stand against people in Saudi Arabia. And I think there is a question need to be answered. Why U.S. has been offering absolute support to Saudi Arabia, in spite of the fact that Saudi Arabia create, support, fund, export the extremists who not just attack the people in Middle East, they attack U.S. itself. Thank you so much.
So if you'd like to address the set of questions that came up. You were not finished all right.
On the, I mean, basically a plan for democracy, I've just explained that nobody wants it, so at least in the region. So I'm not sure my plan would be of much value. So I'm just will pass on your question, and I think I'm sorry about that. It's very flippant of me. Yemen is a fascinating story. Yes, the Houthis are at the doors of Sana'a, or at least they're now supposedly even part of the government or something like this. Anyway, we'll see how that develops. Well, that was one of the reasons I started questioning the whole Saudi military issue, is after 50 years of U.S. training, 50 years of U.S. training, $400 billion of armaments, 3,000 Houthi rebels beat the Saudi army. And, you know, it's questions, not so much to the Saudi army that, why are we doing this? You know, it is a very important point, and I'm sure Bernard can answer that much more than that, much more than me. On the lady from Saudi Arabia, let me just say that Saudi Arabia is not a heaven, and I'm not recommending that we should all go to heaven in Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, as I think Karen mentioned, it's not as bad as many other places around. And there are oftentimes ways to talk to people, even though it's a dictatorship, absolutely a dictatorship, no problem there. But, so I don't disagree with you. I think in terms of what is the interest of the United States, I think we have to support the stability in the region for sure. But I would like to say, which I think is extremely important, is why is the U.S. as a government always in favor or promoting contacts with the royal family? And that always drove me a little, because I have seen over the years the actions of the State Department. And the State Department, basically, we have of the Foreign Department here who could tell us about that, but basically the State Department only talked to princes. And you don't agree, Al, but at the higher levels, the royal family wants to make sure we talk to them, and you know, they view that it's very important, and they will talk to the royal family first. And the royal family as the only people who make decisions in Saudi Arabia, and that, in my view, is totally false. The Saudis, you know, work much more by consensus. The civil service in Saudi Arabia is extremely strong and extremely important. And I view that ministers like Ali al-Naimi and Minister of Oil is stronger than, you know, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia in terms the ability of the Minister of Finance, Mr. Al-Assaf, is probably stronger than any prince in Saudi Arabia. Now, not stronger than the king, you know, but we should be, you know, focusing on this type of people rather than just the 15, 20,000 members of the royal family. So that, I think, your point that you brought this allowed me to say this, and I thank you.
I think we learned from Iraq that we cannot deliver democracy to people. The Saudis, if that's what they want, are to push for it themselves. But we could help in whether they want democracy or simply more transparency and accountability and individual human dignity. We could help by articulating those repeatedly as American values. And as Bernard said earlier, these are Islamic. It's not like, you know, this is some big gap between American democracy and Islam. Some basic human dignity and guarantees for justice that exist in Islam. And the fact that the President of the United States will go there, as he did last March, and not raise a word about human rights, and, you know, by giving an award to Maho Munif, who's a very worthy woman, but a photo opportunity is simply not the same as speaking to senior government officials like we used to with the old Soviet Union. It's not like they said, oh, yeah, we ever think of that? But we kept talking to them about it. And we don't even dare raise these issues increasingly anymore. And I think that is a huge disservice to our own country and our own reputation, even when people see us as hypocrites because we're, quote, supporting the royal family for stability reasons while enunciating our belief in human dignity. I mean, life is full of trade-offs, but to just trade off without ever even stating what you believe in, to me, is really a big mistake. The kingdom has a culture of, unfortunately, obedience, again, because the way the royal family's religious establishment espouses that it is better to obey the ruler, even if he's a raisin-headed Abyssinian. They constantly create this view that you must obey at all costs. So that's something the Saudis themselves have to confront, but we should at least express our own view that there is a right to human dignity. There is a right to say something without being jailed for 10 years because the point that people who have arrested should either be charged and tried or freed. I mean, that is what some of the human rights activists are in jail for now, among other things. And the fact that we won't even mention it, I think, is really doing our own country a big disservice.
As far as what either this institution or any American institution can do with respect to democracy promotion, it's a big problem because there are some good people in Saudi Arabia asking for very good things on very good grounds, not even in terms of Western democracy, but just in terms of Islamic standards of justice and accountability. Thing is, if you as Americans back those people, you will discredit them, and that is a legacy of American foreign policy towards the region, unfortunately. So I think it's best to leave them alone. Although America's role is huge and valued and underestimated because it can actually put considerable pressure on the royal family. So I have a very sort of complicated and cautious answer to your question. On Yemen, the Saudis have spent a lot of money in Yemen. And it would be interesting to compare the two. Yemen is a failed state. And its failure, I think, going forward, will lead to many millions of Yemenis ultimately trying to just literally walk across the border into Saudi Arabia. Certainly the Saudis have not pursued good policies because they've just thrown money at different individuals in the country, incredibly corrupt, like the Ahmar brothers, for instance. And so it's not well spent, the money. But Yemen also has problems that have nothing to do with Saudi Arabia, that are internal to Yemen, and that have led to the failure of the state that we see today. It seems to me that one of the best policies that the Saudis could pursue in Yemen today would be to come to some sort of accommodation with the Houthis and try to tear the Houthis away from the Iranian support, if possible. And I'm not sure whether that would be possible. But the Houthis are a key, I think, now for the stability of northern Yemen, area that borders Saudi Arabia. And if they remain in the orbit of Iran, and if they become more radicalized, then they pose a very grave danger to the Saudis. As does Yemen in general, as a whole, as a country, because of its deep structural problems. The country's running out of oil, no water, huge population growth, economic, I mean, the list of one sort of catastrophic statistic after another goes on and on. And it's something that the Saudis should be terrified of.
So we're just about out of time. There was one more question here, if we can, just a short question, if we can squeeze that in.
Hi, my name is Maggie Proctor. I'm with Creative Associates International. I was just interested to hear a little bit more about how the new anti-terrorism law in Saudi Arabia plays into this dynamic, what relationship it has to the fragility of the regime, or any interest in reform or lack thereof. Thank you.
I think it's just, of course, an excuse to arrest anybody who says the wrong thing, and that has been a very positive approach to all the problems of the Gulf in general. I mean, in Bahrain, you cannot even say that the king could perhaps be wrong. You'll be in jail because that's against the law. It's the same in the UAE, it's the same in Saudi Arabia, this whole lèse-majesté type of approach to making sure that you can put anybody in jail at any one time. Under a veneer of law. It's the same type of things, I think. So I don't know exactly how you go about resolving it. I think, of course, it's pure hypocrisy. Of course, that's politics, I suppose. But it is very, very, very sad. I don't have an answer to your question.
So we're right at 2 o'clock at the end of our time. I think this discussion on Saudi Arabia revealed just how complex the questions are and how difficult they are. But I'm happy we pulled these speakers together because they handled all these difficult issues in such a superb way. And thanks to all of you for your questions. Thank you very much.